The records never existed in Swedish railway archives. 1940 to 1944 operations were missing. 60 years later, an elderly Norwegian revealed, there was an engineer at the border who saved us. We never learned his name, but we owed our lives to him. Welcome to Silent Legends. Before we unveil the story of a train engineer who transported more than passengers, who operated the most crucial lifeline between occupied Norway and neutral Sweden, tell me in the comments from which city are you watching this video today? And if you believe some heroes move through history as quietly as trains through the night, subscribe to witness stories that time forgot, but history never will. Stockholm, Sweden, October 2004. The Swedish Railway Museum's archive stretched through basement corridors like underground tunnels, housing a century of transportation history. Wooden shelves reached toward fluorescent lights, laden with locomotive specifications, route schedules, and the bureaucratic remnants of a nation's movement through time. Astrid Andersson, 73 and methodical in her research, had been searching these archives for 3 months. Her grandfather, Lars Andersson, had been a train engineer for Swedish state railways from 1925 until his death in 1963. She was compiling family history for her grandchildren, hoping to understand the quiet man who had raised her after her parents died in a car accident in 1955. What she had discovered instead was a mystery that grew more puzzling with each passing day. "I'm sorry, Miss Andersson," said Henrik Malmberg, the museum's chief archivist, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he reviewed her request forms. "But the records you're asking for simply don't exist." Astrid spread her research across the reading table in the archive's main research room. Train schedules, personnel files, maintenance logs, all meticulously documented and preserved, creating an unbroken record of Swedish railway operations from 1900 to the present. Except for one glaring gap. "Mr. Malmberg," she said, her voice carrying the patience of someone who had spent decades as a university librarian, "my grandfather worked the Charlottenburg-Storlien line from 1940 to 1944. That was one of the busiest routes during the war years, connecting Sweden to the Norwegian border. There should be thousands of documents." Henrik nodded sympathetically. "You're absolutely correct. There should be. But everything from that period, that specific route, appears to have been lost." "Lost?" Astrid's eyebrows rose. "Accidentally?" The official explanation is that a warehouse fire in 1947 destroyed those particular records. "But..." Henrik paused, glancing around the empty reading room before continuing in a lower voice. "Between you and me, Miss Andersson, that explanation has never made sense. Those records would have been stored in the main archives, not in a warehouse. And only those specific years, that specific route? It's highly unusual." Astrid had spent enough years as a research librarian to recognize the difference between missing information and deliberately erased information. This felt like the latter. "Mr. Malmberg, is there anyone else I could speak with? Someone who might remember my grandfather or have access to alternative records?" Henrik considered this carefully. "There is one possibility. Nils Bergström worked as a dispatcher during those years. He's 94 now, lives in a care facility in Gothenburg, but his memory is still sharp. If anyone would remember unusual activities on that line, it would be him." 3 days later, Astrid sat in the common room of Sommergarden Care Facility, facing a man whose eyes held the clarity of someone who had spent decades watching trains move through Swedish landscapes with clockwork precision. Nils Bergström was small and bent with age, but when Astrid mentioned her grandfather's name, his posture straightened with unmistakable recognition. "Lars Andersson," he said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of decades. "Now there's a name I haven't heard spoken aloud in 60 years. You knew my grandfather? Knew him?" Nils laughed, a sound that mixed fondness with something deeper. "Miss, your grandfather was one of the finest engineers Swedish railways ever employed. And one of the most secretive." Astrid leaned forward. "Secretive how?" Nils studied her face carefully, as if weighing whether she could be trusted with information he had kept buried for 6 decades. Finally, he reached a decision. "Your grandfather ran trains that didn't officially exist, on schedules that were never recorded, carrying passengers who were never documented. He paused, watching Astrid's reaction. Did you know that Sweden rescued nearly 8,000 Norwegian refugees during the war? I've read about the rescue operations, yes. What you haven't read about, Nils continued, is how most of those refugees actually reached safety. The official histories talk about boat rescues across the Skagerrak, diplomatic interventions, organized evacuations. All true, but incomplete. Nils gestured toward the window, beyond which the Gothenburg rail yards were visible in the distance. The real lifeline ran on steel tracks. Your grandfather operated what we called the ghost trains, locomotive runs that picked up refugees at secret border crossings and transported them to safety in Swedish cities. Astrid felt her understanding of her grandfather's life shifting fundamentally. Ghost trains? Every Tuesday and Friday night, for 4 years, your grandfather would take an empty freight locomotive from Charlottenburg to supposedly check track conditions along the Norwegian border. Officially, these were maintenance runs, routine inspections that appeared on no passenger schedules. Nils leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper despite the empty common room. But those trains were never empty, Miss Andersson. They carried families fleeing the Nazi occupation of Norway. Your grandfather would meet them at predetermined locations, abandoned stations, forest clearings, anywhere the tracks ran close to the border, and transport them to safety in Stockholm, Gothenburg, or Malmö. The magnitude of what Nils was describing hit Astrid like a physical blow. Her quiet, methodical grandfather, the man who had taught her to tie her shoes and helped with homework, who never spoke of the war years, had been operating a clandestine rescue network. How many people? She asked quietly. I can't give you exact numbers because those records were deliberately destroyed. But over 4 years, making 2 runs per week. Nils calculated silently. Hundreds. Maybe thousands. That evening, Astrid sat in her Stockholm apartment, surrounded by the family documents she had inherited when her grandfather died. Letters, photographs, railway memorabilia, items she had treasured as connections to family history now demanded re-examination through this new lens. She opened her grandfather's personal effects box, which she had previously browsed casually but now studied with forensic attention. Among his possessions was a leather-bound notebook she had assumed contained routine work observations. Now, reading more carefully, she began to notice patterns that had escaped her earlier attention. Entry after entry contained what appeared to be maintenance notes, track inspection completed. No irregularities observed. Weather conditions favorable. But reading between the lines, Astrid began to decode a different meaning. Weather conditions favorable might refer to border security being light. No irregularities observed could mean successful transfers with no complications. And the dates of these entries corresponded exactly with the Tuesday and Friday schedule Nils had described. More revealing were the maps. Her grandfather had kept detailed topographical maps of the Swedish-Norwegian border region, marked with annotations that made no sense for routine railway maintenance. Small symbols appeared at various points along the tracks, crosses, circles, triangular marks that seemed to indicate specific locations. But it was a photograph tucked between the pages of the notebook that stopped Astrid completely. The image showed her grandfather standing beside his locomotive, but he wasn't alone. Behind him, partially visible in the shadow of the train car, were several figures, men, women, children in heavy winter clothing, carrying bundles and suitcases. On the back of the photograph, in her grandfather's careful handwriting, was a date, December 15, 1943. Below that, a simple notation, safe passage. Astrid realized she was looking at evidence of the rescue operation Nils had described. But this raised new questions. If her grandfather had been conducting this operation for 4 years, he couldn't have been working alone. Such an elaborate network would have required coordination, support, and official protection at the highest levels. The next morning, Astrid called Henrik Malmberg at the Railway Museum. Mr. Malmberg, when you mentioned that the records were destroyed in a warehouse fire, did you say 1947? Yes, that's the official date listed. But the war ended in 1945. Why would they wait 2 years to destroy wartime records? Henrik paused. That's an excellent question, Miss Andersson. One that I've wondered about myself. Is there any way to verify what actually happened to those records? Well, I suppose we could check with the National Archives. Sometimes government agencies maintain secondary copies of important transportation documents, especially those related to wartime activities. The Swedish National Archives occupied an imposing building in Stockholm's government district, its neoclassical facade suggesting the weight of the historical documents contained within. Astrid had submitted her research request a week earlier and was now meeting with Dr. Elisabeth Lindqvist, a senior archivist specializing in wartime documentation. Miss Andersson, Dr. Lindqvist said as she led Astrid through secure corridors toward the research room, your request raised some interesting flags in our system. Records related to wartime railway operations along the Norwegian border are classified under our sensitive historical materials designation. Sensitive how? Materials that relate to operations that weren't publicly acknowledged at the time, or that involved cooperation with foreign governments or organizations. Dr. Lindqvist stopped at a heavy security door. Your grandfather's name appears in several documents that have only recently been declassified. They entered a climate-controlled research room where boxes of documents waited on a table. Dr. Lindqvist handed Astrid white cotton gloves and gestured toward the materials. These documents come from multiple sources: the Foreign Ministry, Defense Department, and Swedish Security Police. They paint a picture of coordinated rescue operations that were officially denied for 60 years. The first box contained correspondence between Swedish government officials and Norwegian resistance leaders. Letters discussing transportation logistics and passenger coordination that clearly referred to refugee movements. But it was the second box that contained the revelation Astrid had been seeking. Official orders, signed by the Director of Swedish Railways and countersigned by the Minister of Defense, authorizing special transport operations along border routes. The orders specified that these operations should leave minimal documentation and that personnel involved should be carefully selected for discretion and reliability. Her grandfather's name appeared on a list of approved special operators, along with 7 other engineers assigned to different border routes. Next to each name was a notation indicating their security clearance level and number of successful operations completed. Lars Andersson, 287 successful transports. 0 incidents. Highest classification maintained. Astrid stared at the number. 287 successful transports over 4 years. If each transport carried multiple refugees, families, resistance fighters, political targets fleeing Nazi persecution, her grandfather had personally saved thousands of lives. But the documents revealed something even more remarkable. The refugee transport operation hadn't been a spontaneous humanitarian effort. It had been a carefully planned, government-sanctioned network coordinated between Swedish authorities and Norwegian resistance leaders. Her grandfather hadn't been a lone hero making individual moral choices, he had been part of a sophisticated intelligence operation. Dr. Lindqvist, Astrid said, looking up from the documents, why were these operations kept secret for so long? Sweden was neutral during the war. Helping refugees should have been a point of pride. Dr. Lindqvist nodded knowingly. That's exactly the question these documents answer. Look at this file. She indicated a folder marked Post-War Security Considerations. Inside were memos from 1945 and 1946 discussing the implications of acknowledging the rescue operations. The Swedish government had concluded that revealing the extent of their covert support for Norwegian resistance activities could complicate post-war relationships with the Soviet Union, which was suspicious of any Western European cooperation during the war years. More practically, many of the transportation routes and border crossing points used during the rescue operations were still being used for ongoing intelligence activities. So they buried the whole program, Dr. Lindqvist explained. Destroyed the operational records, classified the government documents, and let the participants fade into anonymity. But why declassify now? Time. The Cold War is over, the participants are mostly deceased, and the intelligence value of those border routes has diminished. Plus, there's been growing academic interest in documenting wartime rescue operations. Armed with this new information, Astrid began reaching out to Norwegian veterans organizations and historical societies. If her grandfather had saved hundreds of Norwegian refugees, some of them might still be alive. Some might remember the quiet Swedish engineer who had helped them reach safety. Her breakthrough came through the Norwegian Resistance Museum in Oslo. Dr. Karen Haugen, the museum's director, listened to Astrid's story with growing excitement. "Miss Andersson, you've stumbled onto something remarkable. We've been researching Swedish rescue operations for years, but most of the Swedish records were destroyed. The stories survive mainly in oral histories from the refugees themselves." Dr. Haugen arranged for Astrid to meet with several elderly Norwegians who had fled to Sweden during the war. The first was Erik Thomsen, now 86, who had escaped Norway in December 1943 after his resistance cell was compromised. "I remember that train ride like it was yesterday," Erik told Astrid as they sat in his Oslo apartment, surrounded by photographs and memorabilia from his resistance years. "We had been walking through the forest for 3 days, hiding from German patrols, when we reached the meeting point, an abandoned station about 5 kilometers into Sweden." Erik's eyes grew distant as he recalled the memory. "It was snowing heavily, and we were exhausted, frightened, certain we would be caught. Then we heard the locomotive approaching. No lights, moving slowly, like a ghost in the snow." "You met my grandfather?" A tall man, very calm, spoke Norwegian with a Swedish accent. "He never told us his name, just said, 'Welcome to Sweden,' and helped us into the freight car. The car had been modified, benches along the walls, blankets, even hot coffee in thermoses." Erik reached for a photo album and showed Astrid a picture of a group of people standing beside a train. "This was taken at the station in Stockholm when we arrived. Your grandfather refused to be in the picture, said it was better if there was no record of his involvement." Over the following weeks, Astrid interviewed 6 more Norwegian refugees who had been transported to safety by her grandfather. Each told similar stories: careful coordination, modified freight cars equipped for human passengers, and an engineer who treated them with dignity and kindness during their most vulnerable moments. But it was her conversation with Ingrid Halvorsen, now 91, that provided the most emotional connection to her grandfather's wartime activities. "He saved my entire family," Ingrid told Astrid during a video call from Bergen. "My husband was a journalist who had written articles criticizing the occupation. The Gestapo came for him in November 1943, but we had been warned and managed to escape into the forest." Ingrid's voice trembled as she continued. "We had been hiding for weeks, my husband, myself, and our 3 children. The youngest was only 2 years old. We were starving, freezing, desperate. When we finally reached the Swedish border, I thought we might not survive another night." "What happened?" "Your grandfather met us at the border station personally. When he saw our condition, especially the children, he didn't just put us in the freight car. He brought us into the locomotive cabin, shared his food with us, let the children sleep on his coat." Ingrid paused, wiping away tears. "My youngest daughter was sick with fever. Your grandfather gave her his scarf and told her stories during the entire journey to keep her calm." Ingrid reached toward her computer camera and held up a small, faded piece of fabric. "I still have that scarf. After the war, I tried to find him, to thank him properly, but the Swedish authorities said there were no records of any rescue trains." That evening, Astrid sat in her apartment, emotionally exhausted by the weight of what she had discovered. Her grandfather's wartime activities represented a level of heroism and humanitarian commitment that she had never imagined. But one question remained: why had he never told anyone, not even his family? She was examining his personal effects once again when she noticed something she had missed before. In his desk drawer, hidden beneath railway manuals and work schedules, was a small envelope marked simply, Astrid. Inside was a letter in her grandfather's familiar handwriting, dated March 1963, just 2 weeks before his death. "My dear granddaughter," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means I am gone and you have discovered the truth about my wartime activities. I always hoped that someday you might learn about this period of my life, but I wanted you to discover it yourself, when you were old enough to understand the complexities involved." The letter continued for 3 pages, explaining his motivations, his fears, and his hopes for the people he had helped rescue. "I was approached in 1940 by representatives of both the Swedish government and the Norwegian resistance," he wrote. "They needed train engineers who could operate covertly along the border routes, people who were reliable, discreet, and committed to saving lives regardless of political considerations. I accepted because I believed that no government, no matter how powerful, has the right to persecute innocent people. The families I transported were not political figures or military targets, they were teachers, shopkeepers, farmers whose only crime was living in a country that had been invaded. But it was the final paragraph that brought Astrid to tears. I never spoke of this work because I wanted you to judge me based on who I was as your grandfather, not on actions I took during extraordinary circumstances. The people I helped deserved to live free from persecution, and I was privileged to play a small role in their survival. If you choose to share this story someday, please remember that heroes are not people who seek recognition, they are people who do what is necessary when it is needed, regardless of whether anyone will ever know. The letter was signed simply, Love, Grandfather, and included a small key. Astrid recognized the key immediately. It opened a storage box in the basement of her grandfather's house, a box she had always assumed contained old railway equipment. Now she understood it contained something far more valuable. The storage box held treasures that would have made historians weep with joy. Photographs of refugee families, letters of gratitude written in Norwegian, Danish, and Swedish, maps marking successful rescue routes, and most importantly, a complete passenger manifest documenting every person her grandfather had transported to safety. Names, ages, origins, destinations, meticulously recorded information that official Swedish records claimed never existed. Her grandfather had maintained his own archive, preserving the memory of people whose lives he had helped save. There were 1,247 names on the lists. Men, women, children from every region of occupied Norway. Resistance fighters, Jewish families fleeing persecution, political refugees, and ordinary civilians caught in the machinery of war. But alongside the official documentation were personal items that revealed the human dimension of her grandfather's work. A child's drawing of a train with the words, Tack snill man, thank you, kind man, written in crayon. A wedding ring given by a refugee who had nothing else to offer in gratitude. Pressed flowers from bouquets given by grateful families. Reading through these materials, Astrid began to understand why her grandfather had chosen silence. The rescue operations hadn't been about heroism or recognition, they had been about preserving human dignity during humanity's darkest hours. 6 months later, Astrid stood before an audience of historians, government officials, and descendants of Norwegian refugees at the Swedish Railway Museum. The museum had organized a special exhibition, The Ghost Trains, Sweden's Secret Rescue Operations, 1940 to 1944. At the center of the exhibition was her grandfather's locomotive, restored to its wartime configuration and equipped with the modifications that had allowed it to transport refugees safely. The freight car displayed photographs, documents, and personal testimonies from the people Lars Andersson had helped save. But the most moving element of the exhibition was a wall of photographs, images of the refugee families he had transported, provided by their descendants who had traveled from across Scandinavia to honor his memory. Eric Thompson, now walking with a cane but still sharp and determined, had traveled from Oslo for the opening ceremony. Lars Andersson never knew the full impact of his actions, Eric told the assembled crowd. He saw individual families, individual moments of rescue. But those families grew, had children, built lives in freedom. Today, there are thousands of people living throughout Scandinavia whose existence can be traced back to the courage of this quiet Swedish train engineer. Ingrid Halvorsson's daughter had flown in from Bergen, carrying the scarf her grandfather had given to a sick child 70 years earlier. Now she presented it to Astrid as part of the museum's permanent collection. Your grandfather taught my mother that kindness and courage are often the same thing, she said during the presentation. This scarf represents not just his generosity, but his understanding that even small gestures of humanity can echo through generations. That evening, as the museum emptied and the exhibition lights dimmed, Astrid stood alone beside her grandfather's locomotive. The massive machine, silent now but still powerful, represented more than transportation technology. It embodied the principle that ordinary people, given extraordinary circumstances, can choose to do extraordinary things. Her phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Haugen at the Norwegian Resistance Museum. Astrid, we've been contacted by a family in Minnesota whose grandmother was rescued by your grandfather in 1944. They're planning to visit Sweden next month and would love to meet you. Astrid smiled, understanding that her grandfather's story would continue to unfold. Every rescued refugee had built a life, raised children, contributed to communities across the world. The ghost train's true cargo hadn't been individual people, it had been the future itself. She thought about the letter he had left for her, his words about heroes being people who do what is necessary when it is needed, regardless of recognition. For 60 years, he had succeeded in that goal, working without acknowledgement, dying without public honor. But now his story would be told. Not as a tale of individual heroism, but as a reminder that the most important journeys often happen in darkness, that the most vital passengers are those seeking nothing more than the right to live in freedom. Have you discovered family secrets that revealed unexpected heroism? Stories of relatives who quietly made the world better without seeking recognition? Sometimes the greatest legacies are written in pencil in hidden notebooks, preserved in basement storage boxes, waiting for the right moment to emerge into light. Share their stories in the comments. Because legends like Lars Andersson remind us that heroism isn't about grand gestures or public acclaim, it's about seeing suffering and choosing to act, even when no one will ever know you were there. Thank you for watching Silent Legends. If this story moved you, subscribe and help us honor those who were never meant to be forgotten. Because sometimes the most important history is written by people who never intended to make history at all, they just intended to help.